Good morning, church. Good to see all of you. This is the Summer of the Child here at Trinity. We got all kinds of things. Vacation Bible School, we got mission trips, we got a Rangers game scheduled. We're going to have an adult vacation Bible school. June 21st and 22nd, right? July 21st, 22nd. Yeah, there we go. Okay, what is it again? Okay, there you go. See, you know who's in charge, don't you? Okay. It's going to be a great event whenever it is, and you'll see it coming up. But we'll have different activities and things for you, and certainly have a snack time. I'm not sure about nap time, but we'll put something in there as well. It is a great series that we're doing. Grow Up to Be Like a Child. We're centering on stories that involve children. This is in particular, the one we just heard, is really the only story in the Old Testament that centers around a particular child listening and hearing the calling of God. I think it's got some great lessons for us as well. So the whole idea is to set the stage that we've all been children, regardless of your age. We all grew up as children. Children have an affinity toward God. Children come into this world as spiritual beings. We don't have to pour into an empty vessel. They're in tune with God. They just don't have the language to articulate it. That's our job, is to give them the framework to understand what they already know and experience. And every week we're going to be showing just a picture, so I'm giving Bart a heads up that we'll show a picture of somebody who's in this room, give you a chance to try to figure out who it is. Should have come with a trigger warning, because gosh, that is cuteness overload, I think is the way in which you describe it. Anybody want to guess who that is? Mark! Mark, is that you? That's Mark. Look at that. Hadn't changed a bit. You haven't changed a bit, Mark. That's good. All right, so let's dive into this passage. If we could, let's bow our heads. God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Some of you have been to Italy. When I went, I found something I didn't know about until I got there. As we were touring a number of places, every time we'd come to a cathedral or a church, an ancient place, you would notice on the side facing the street there was a little opening. Sometimes it was covered up, sometimes it was still exposed. And our guide was telling us what it was. I'd never heard this before. It's called a ruota, which means a fowling wheel. In the Roman culture, they did not really particularly honor children as well as we might think they would have. In fact, children were often abandoned to the streets. Parents who couldn't afford to feed them would just simply give them up, or they were sold or trafficked or abandoned or abused. And the church understood the dilemma of so many children homeless on the streets of Rome and other places that Pope Innocent III, in 1198, issued an edict that every church put together in this church a ruota, which is a fowling wheel, which means in the middle of the night, if a mother had to make the awful choice of giving up their child, they could come to the church, place it on this wheel, and then ring a bell. And then the wheel would turn, and so the child would go inside the church, and on the other side would be a nun or someone to care for the child. Often they would attach a ribbon or a note or a piece of clothing in the hope that someday they may come back when things change to retrieve their child. And I remember walking into a church and seeing a whole wall from hundreds of years ago of mothers who had left ribbons and notes and pieces of clothing. And it became very real, this incredible gut-wrenching decision to give up your own child. And what does it take for a woman or a parent to give up their child, trusting and believing that whatever is in front of them is a better life than they can offer them, and how hard and difficult that must be? I stood in court with a woman who chose us to help raise her child, believing we could offer him a better life in this world. It's gut-wrenching. It's hard. Hannah makes the same choice. It's Hannah's choice. In fact, Hannah, if you read this story, go back to its origin and beginning, Hannah is what the Bible describes as barren, which is an awful term, meaning she does not have children. And she's getting to an age where it doesn't seem like she will ever have children. And the culture is, if you're not having children, you're not blessed. In fact, you might be cursed by God. And barren is not just a cruel word. It also describes, I think, her spirit. She's empty. She's bereft. She's barren. So she begins to pray like she's never prayed before. She gets on her knees praying to God for a child, a son in particular. And she makes a promise to God, God, if you will grant me a son, I promise I will give him back to you. And she does just that. And when the child comes, Samuel, it's Hannah who takes her to Shiloh, to the temple, and to Eli, the old priest, to give him to the temple, that he would be raised as a priest, that she would let go of her own son, honoring the promise that she made, receiving the joy that her prayer was answered. It answered in a particular way, gives them over to do that. I mean, how does a mother do that, to give them over? Somehow the early church became the place where people would give their child up, and Hannah understands that the temple is a place where he's going to be raised. He's going to become a prophet. How does she do that? How do you let go of the very thing that is most important to you? I think what Hannah understands is what a lot of us have already forgotten, that we're stewards, not owners. We have gifts and not possessions. Our children are not ours to possess. They are gifts for us to nurture, to guide, to support, and to help guide them and navigate through the waters of life. It's a foreign concept to people that we don't own things that we take for granted that we own. And in our culture, that's what we do. We're convinced that what we have is ours, meaning I own it, I worked for it, I earned it, I possess it, it's mine. And we say things like, well, this is my house, these are my kids, this is my life, this is my church, and everything is revolving around my, as if we own it. But the Bible says we are stewards, not owners. We have gifts, not possessions. As a United Methodist minister, I'm an itinerant minister, so is Sharon, so is Carly. We have an understanding that when we say yes to the bishop, we give up our future right to sort of build a career, decide where we want to go and what's best for us. We just simply say we will go wherever we're sent. And I look back over the course of my ministry, and there's not a single time I would have thought, gosh, if I sat down at a table and thought, here's really where I want to go, that never happened once. The bishop called, said, you're going here. And I already made a promise, and so I went wherever I was sent. And there's something liberating about that in a strange way, because it says your life is not your own. Your job is not to build a career ladder. Your job is not to construct whatever life you think you ought to. It's just to serve faithfully wherever you have been placed, wherever you have been sent. We are stewards, not owners. Jesus tells this parable that I think is so relevant today. He talks about this vineyard and an absentee owner who just sort of relies on his servants, but the servants begin to assume they own the place. And so the owner sends other servants to help them understand it's not yours, and they beat them up, send them off, and finally he's to the point, one after another, he said, I'll send my son. He sends his son. And the rebellious vineyard workers rise up and kill the son because they think they own the place. They're not just stewards of it. It's not my life. It's not my children. It's not my church. It's God. We're just stewards of everything God has entrusted with us. You don't own the church. Some people think they do. And if you push for a vote to decide who owns the church, you're missing the entire point of what stewardship really is. It's not our church. These are not our children. This whole week, I hope you had some sense. We have the privilege of receiving them, helping them grow in their faith and teaching the fundamental things that we think are important in life. And it's just a privilege, but they're not ours. At some point, we let them go. And at some point in your life, with your children, you'll have this sense. They were just on loan, and God chose you to help raise them. So Samuel learns as he grows older from the priest, and as he's given to the temple and to Eli, he grows up. Now he's about 12 years old, which is an age of awareness. Did you catch the first line that Sharon also read? The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Meaning nobody's really heard from God in a long, long time, and we go through these seasons where everybody's thinking, where is God, and why don't we hear from God, and why don't we have some sense of disconnect from God? And this is the kind of culture that sort of Samuel rises into. And it talks about Eli the priest, that his eyes are so dim that he cannot see. I hope you catch the irony of that. He's got a priest who's been talking about God for so long, he's lost touch with God. that he can no longer see, he can no longer hear God. He's sort of run his course, and he's come to that age where he's almost given up hope that God is ever going to intervene. The great irony is it's not Eli, the old priest who's been preaching about God all of his life. It's the child who knows God, hears God, listens to God. You've heard the story. He's lying in bed at night, 12 years old. Hears a voice, thinks it's the old priest Eli calling him, goes in. Did you call me? No, I didn't call you. Goes back to bed. Again hears the voice. Goes again to Eli. Eli, did you call me? No, it was not me. Finally, Eli catches on about the third time. He comes into the room and suspects maybe God is trying to talk to Samuel. So he says, go back, lie down. When you hear the voice again, say, speak, for your servant is listening. I don't know about you, but we all struggle with how do we know the voice of God? How do we recognize? How do we know it's actually God for us? And there are people who would honestly admit God's never actually spoken verbally to them. There are other people you meet that God speaks to them all the time about parking places that are open, about which city to live in, what things to buy. And there's this constant stream of conversations. And some people who don't have that experience sort of scratch their head and wonder why I don't hear those kinds of things. And then some people wrestle with the idea is what I'm hearing really God's voice, or is it just my own sort of self-talk to myself? Do I just live in my own echo chamber? Hearing the voice of God is a strange thing if you think about it. And the Bible doesn't really pretend to be anything other than that. It's a strange occurrence. I saw an interview with Kevin Costner the other day, and I thought it was great. He was talking about Field of Dreams. Remember this movie? About an Iowa farmer, goes out in the cornfields, hears the voice of God saying, build it, and they will come. He was talking about how he got the role. He said something I'd never heard before. He said the first person they chose to actually do the role was not Kevin Costner, it was Robin Williams. He said the problem was Robin Williams was exactly the kind of person you would think would go out in the cornfield and hear voices. And they needed somebody who was the opposite of that. And that's how he got the role. Children can hear God, I think, because they're just more open, honest, innocent. I think because they're not so full of themselves or other things. I think because they still believe. And they still have this open sense of awe and wonder about the world. They think all things really are possible. We say it, they actually believe it. But somehow the voices they hear are going to change them, and part of the problem is us. We do our best to make sure they grow up, that they'll listen to other things, get a good education, get a good job, make sure you find something that's going to pay you money, listen to your own voice, follow your own dreams. And I don't even think we're aware of sometimes what we say to children because we've said it so often and it's a different voice and we're not even sure what we're saying when we say it. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, my parents used to put me to bed. Here's what they would say. You know this. Now I lay me down to sleep. What? I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray my soul the Lord to take. And then they'd say good night. And I would think, oh my gosh, am I not going to make it through the night? Are you saying I'm going to die before I wake up? I mean, do we even know what we're saying to our kids? They'd say the prayer and they'd say good night. And I would go, well, thanks. I hope to see you in the morning sometime. So the best advice that old Eli, hard to hear blind priest Eli gives is listen. So how do you know when it's God's voice? It's not your own voice telling you what you want to hear, or not the voice that tells you that you're already right about everything you already believe. It's not the voice saying, thank God I'm not like those people. That's not the voice, and not the voice of someone who claims that they speak for God. No, how do you actually hear the voice of God in your life in the context of where you live and breathe? I can only speak for myself, and I've been in ministry for a long time. There was a moment when I felt God's presence, and I gave my life to God. I gave my life to ministry and to service. And as flawed, as imperfect as we are, I felt like I heard the call. But I will tell you, I've never in my life heard the audible voice of God spoken in English. But there was no doubt in my mind that God was calling me. So I don't know what to tell you, but I'll tell you what I have learned. That if you want to know whether it's God or something else, if it's God, there are certain things that are going to happen. One, it's going to feel more like a tug on your heart than a scream from heaven. It also is going to surprise you. because you won't feel up to it. Certainly not going to ever feel worthy of it. It's going to change you. It's almost a guarantee it's going to make your life more complicated, more difficult. It's going to cost you. You're going to have to sacrifice things you did not anticipate having to sacrifice. There's going to be obstacles and challenges you never imagined in between you and what God is calling you to do. And it's never going to be exactly what you think it is. It's never going to be a linear route. It's going to be a journey that's going to take you to places you never imagined going, to do things you never imagined doing. And you won't be able to do it on your own. That's the true test of God's calling, without God's help. If you can do it on your own, then God didn't call you to do it. And the last thing I can assure you is that if it truly comes from God, it's not going to pass. It's not going to let you go. It will follow you. It will embed itself in you, and it will never let you go. You cannot outrun it. You can't outfun it. You can't ignore it. You can't walk away from it. It takes hold of you, and it will not let you go until you say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I know it's less than satisfying for a lot of you because you really want to be sure we all do. You need to be convinced, is God speaking to me? You want to make sure there's not a single doubt in your mind that it's Him, and I wish I could help you, but I can't. But I also know somebody who can help you in that regard. And he says this: the sheep hear His voice, and He calls His own sheep by name and leads them out. When He has brought out all of His own, He goes before them, and the sheep follow them, for they know His voice. Or as we say, when you know, you know.